get it made as Chinatown. Just wanted to say that. Such a quintessential Aussie sentiment. So I make my way here through Chinatown. So Australia didn't have an exclusive white Australia policy in 1780 or 1805. Only developed it around the turn of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. So there used to be a lot more Chinese and Japanese here. Then after we got the exclusionary white Australia policy steadily implemented in the first 70 years of the 20th century, the number of Chinese and Japanese in the country steadily declined. But we've always had a Chinatown here in Sydney. It waxed and it waned, but now about between 15 to 20% of Australia's population is Asian. And I was listening to Richard Spencer here. He did an interview with a philosopher named David Skirbina. So let's play some of this.
That's the nature of the belief system.
Right.
I think that seems to be how the early critiques went. It was just, this was a cultish, weird group that were rabble rousers and troublemakers, and we just don't like them. That was kind of what the Roman view seems to have been.
Do you think it spoke to a bit of a different perspective on divinity in the ancient world, in the sense that in my reading of ancient texts, you don't get a kind of skeptic in the version of the world, a word that we know today, attack on Zeus, where's the evidence, so on. I think it...
Yeah, so what it means to be divine definitely changes depending on time and place. So David Skirbina is an atheist, and he's presenting his understanding of the mythology of the origins of Christianity.
Probably spoke to just a different perspective on what the gods were. And in some ways, fundamentalists of today are more rigorous and demanding a kind of historicity. I mean, I even remember when I went to an Episcopalian service last Easter, the priest...
Yeah, there's no sense of historicity in the 13th century, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. People weren't talking about historicity. So that's a relatively post-Enlightenment concern.
Credit, I would say, is that you have to believe this. This isn't just some narrative that you can draw a moral from. You actually have to.
Yeah, even the very notion of belief is different. So the ancients experienced the world differently. So it's not just a matter that conservatives and liberals believe different things, they experience different things. To be conservative is to have more of a traditional or medieval mindset. Obviously some conservatives are more medieval than others. While to be liberal is to have a more modern mindset. What do you mean by modern? We get down to here different understandings of the self, right? The liberal modern conception is the self is buffered, is strategic, autonomous, basically good, it's rational. And the traditional sense of the self is that it's porous, right? What's going on outside of it affects it, and tends towards wickedness. And so we have these two various definitions of the self. And so conservatives experience the world differently from liberals, right? There's more magic in the conservative or traditional worldview. There's this higher realm of the sacred, right? And so it's not so much a matter of belief, but conservatives have experienced the divine differently than modern liberals. And so the ancients too experienced divinity differently. They experienced divinity in a thunderstorm, right? They experienced divinity in an earthquake, all right? So they are much more mindful of sacred spaces, sacred peoples, than moderns who increasingly live in a less magical, mystical world. Boy, so you not only drive on the left side here in Australia, you also walk on the left side.
And he rose from the dead. I think in some ways, to his credit, he was taking his religion seriously, but I think maybe in the ancient world, they just had a different perspective on the divine, and to suggest that, did Zeus really come down and, Father Perseus, or this was kind of missing the whole point, and we're kind of projecting our own, viewpoints backwards.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a very modern scientific way of thinking, right? To ask for evidence, to construct logical arguments, look for proofs.
Right, to ask for evidence, to construct logical arguments, right? This is a different way of thinking than what the ancients or the medievalists experienced.
That kind of stuff. And that doesn't come about until the 1600s. So prior to that time, it was just, I don't believe you, or that sounds crazy. And, of course, none of them were really on sound basis, right? I mean, they all had their own competing gods and mythology. So it wouldn't do any good to say, hey, your God has no evidence, because actually my God has no evidence either. So what the heck? Right. You poke around.
So in the ancient world, if your country won in a conflict or your people won in a conflict, like your God won, and the conquered peoples accepted your deity, it wasn't so much a matter of belief, it was a matter of real life experience. People experience the light world, and they experience the divine in a whole different way than we do.
I don't blame you for that, because I don't have the evidence for mine either, so I can just say, well, I don't like yours, or yours sounds silly, or it sounds crazy. It was very, very loose kind of critiques.
Well, also, I think what is unique about Christianity is that pretense of historicity. And in the sense of, if you read Matthew, say the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, so that is somewhere where Judaism and Christianity are different, but these are religions that make historical claims that God entered human history.
You can take that as a plausible report, I guess, of what was said. There seems to be, 2,000 years ago, an almost kind of new perspective on religion, where this actually happened then and there, and we're going to report on it. And so I guess there's this kind of double quality to Christianity in that sense, in that it does have a pretense of historicity, which I think is really powerful and important to it. But then it's also, reviving other myth systems and kind of spinning them and so on. And I think maybe that doesn't allow us to kind of see mythicism correctly, or the mythical quality in Christianity correctly, because there is something kind of...
So, if you understand your religion, you're not really religious, all right? Like, if you understand spirituality, you're not really spiritual, all right? For a genuine religious or spiritual person, this is a realm of mystery, and you only get intimations about how it works. So once you stand outside of religion and try to understand it using secular rational terms, you have left the religious experience.
Modern about Christianity in the sense that it was a real God, a somewhat poor carpenter who came out and spoke and told moral lessons. It's something that can kind of appeal in a way to a more modern sensibility, but that kind of blinds us to the mythic quality and the essence of Christianity as well.
Right. Well, again, keep right. I mean, the New Testament does read kind of like a transcript at points about what Jesus said. It's like you're actually sort of there. That was kind of the idea. But of course, that general idea had been around for a long time. And we can go back to Plato's Apology, which is basically a transcript of what Socrates said in his own defense, and that was 400 years prior to the time of Jesus.
So everything has similarities with what went before it, and differences. Right? So there are similarities between Judaism and the cultures and religions that surrounded it, and in which it was embedded. There are similarities and there are differences. There are similarities between Christianity and the cultures from which it arose, and differences. But just because you notice things that are similar between Judaism and Christianity or Islam and the cultures from which these religions arose doesn't mean that you deny that there aren't innovations and changes. Right? You could list off 5 ways that I'm different from Laponius. That doesn't mean that there aren't 15 ways that we're similar.
So there was a long intellectual tradition of that happening, and I highly suspect that Paul and the New Testament writers were aware of that tradition. And of course they were aware of the mythological traditions, the pagan traditions, and I think they sort of saw this little blending, merging of the intellectual respect. So
Christianity is explicitly claiming to be grafted on to the religion of the Jews. But what's not explicit in Christianity are its profound roots in Hellenic mystery cult religion. That's not made explicit, but it's just under the surface. So Christianity, throughout its history, has kind of oscillated from the Hellenic mystery cult, pagan ritual sacrifice cults, and its Jewish elements.
Of the Greeks and Platonic sort of writing, and then blended that with pagan and mythological ideas, and it's kind of a nice sort of happy mixture that they used to construct this Christian theology.
Interesting. So why don't you talk a little bit about your version of mythicism? So as you lay out at the beginning of your book, there are a number of people who have taken this up. Really in the 19th century, particularly with German criticism, they were kind of dissecting the Bible for the first time in a way. This was the origin of the documentary hypothesis of different authors that were blended together into these texts, and there are obvious contradictions in the Bible. Where do those derive from in different sources?
So during the course of the 19th century, it appeared that biblical criticism was just going to completely destroy Christianity. But then Christianity took a turn away from historical criticism to other forms of textual criticism that weren't as threatening to its fundamental theology.
And then there was, figures like Bruno Bauer, who Marx got into various disputes with, but there was a kind of atheism brewing out of the Hegelian tradition, you could say as well. But maybe talk a little bit about that tradition, because I actually find that interesting. We sometimes seem to be reinventing the wheel of new atheism, or Richard Dawkins was the first man to ever question whether God exists, and that's actually kind of ridiculous. That this is a very long tradition. Maybe talk a little bit about that. I find that intellectual history really interesting, and then also how your version of this is quite different, in fact.
Yeah. All right. So skepticism about the gods. I mean, you're right. That goes way back. I would go back again to the ancient Greeks. Because Socrates talked very little about the gods, or just sort of in a little hand-waving kind of way. And Plato talked about demiurge. It's the world soul, but those are sort of very distant, abstract things. And Aristotle kind of had this world mind that was kind of turning the cosmos, but again, a very abstract, philosophical kind of being. So they, in no sense, were those like sort of modern gods, which is like a personal being that you can kind of talk to and you pray to him, and he gives you forgiveness and so forth. So I mean, those are very old ideas, right? To sort of be skeptical about gods that look like humans, the anthropomorphized kind of gods that we have traditionally associated with religions. And that kind of comes and goes over the years. Of course, with science, right, that gave it a whole new books, right, in the 1700s in particular. Scientific reasoning, starts to say, well, look, we don't even need these mythological tales anymore. We can just talk about materialistic explanations of things. And then they look at the Christian story and they say, oh, by the way, there's a lot of weird contradictions in that story and things that don't seem to make sense. And at the same time, the German anthropologists are digging up, ruins and hunting for evidence in the Middle East, and they're finding that things aren't where they're supposed to be, and they're not finding evidence of cities that are mentioned. They're like, well, maybe that city never actually existed. Maybe this thing is a lot newer than it would seem to be, or maybe a lot older than it seemed to be. And they were starting to get actual data that was conflicting with the story. The story had internal contradictions, and then that raises people like Bruno Bauer and Reimarus and early David Strauss, who were really started to press hard on the Christian story. They're like, hey, this just don't fly. There's major problems here, internal and external, and that really started the ball rolling. I think.
Definitely. So what you are offering really is, I guess, is kind of picking up on instances in Nietzsche of focusing on Paul, and I think you actually lay it out in your book quite well, where you're saying, okay, there is a lot of mythical criticism of the Bible and so on, but we actually need to get to intention and motivation. And this wasn't just some accident or an honest mistake in the sense that the people doing this really believed it. At some point, they were consciously creating a myth that they wanted to have that they wanted to have an effect in the world. And so, granted, when we're looking back into history, you always have to use some informed speculation. You can't know things for sure, but you actually.
So in politics, you often see people lying, for a noble cause. So when Republicans say that Joe Biden's not the legitimately elected president of the United States, they're lying for what they see as a noble cause of rallying the Republican base. And crusaders against this or that will often exaggerate the harms of whatever it is that they're crusading against. So lying or exaggerating in service of a noble cause or in service of your people, very common human phenomenon. It's not just restricted to religion.
Actually can intuit a certain intent and motivation in people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think there's a very clear motivation. I think Nietzsche was maybe one of the first to pick up on it, although it wasn't really very clear, because just the way Nietzsche writes, it's sort of scattered bits and pieces in his writings. It takes a lot of work to pull those threads together. But I mean, Romans there until 63 BC when the Romans come marching in and throw them out of power. The Romans take over, and the Jews, like anybody else, would have been highly incensed at these foreign intruders.
Okay, so that's important for understanding the origins of Christianity, that there wasn't a Jewish power structure running Palestine at the time of Jesus. The Romans were running it. It was the Romans who would crucify people. Crucifixion was not something that Jews practiced. Right? Crucifixion was something that Jews found horrific. So Romans are kind of shadowy characters in the New Testament. G'day mate, 40 here, listening to Richard Spencer's conversation with his philosopher David Skarbina.
Intruders who threw them out of power, probably pilfered their temples, and extracted taxes and tributes and so forth.
So he's talking about when the Romans took control of Palestine, they stole, they murdered, they raped. Right, so in the Gospels, the Romans are these kind of shadowy figures, right? Even though they're the ones who are actually running things in first century Palestine at the time of Jesus.
Yeah, obviously a lot of resentment, a lot of anger there by the people who were in charge, which was the various Jewish tribes. The people who were there.
You think, normally people are excited to be invaded and conquered and have, foreigners ruling them. Really?
They're the masses to them, and I sort of portrayed it in the book this way, saying it was kind of a change in government. Okay, we used to be ruled by the Jews. Okay, now we're ruled by the Romans, and actually the Romans got some pretty cool stuff that they're bringing in here that we've never seen before. So you can imagine, even for the masses, it was actually a positive move. They saw some gains, and okay, we never really liked the Jews anyway, so we're happy to have the Romans.
Yeah, so the kingdom of heaven, from a Jewish perspective, 2,000 years ago, it meant self-rule, right? Jews in control of their own destiny. Right? It wasn't an otherworldly thing. It wasn't, salvation to another world. It was about salvation in this world, away from the barbaric Romans and their cruel regime.
Come in and sort of run the show. But obviously the Jews have been highly incensed at this whole situation. And we know this because there's a story of the early resistance movement that comes right around the year zero with the curate movement, when these guys were basically assassins.
So yeah, there are many different Jewish responses to the Romans. Right? Some just tried to make the best of things, right? Just cede to power. Another approach was like revolution and assassination, right? So many different Jewish approaches 2,000 years ago. There are many different Jewish sects. There were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, the assassins.
Kind of, renegade killers trying to assassinate individual Romans as a way to attack them, to get back at them. Okay, of course, you're facing the largest military in the world, so you have limited options at that point. But obviously, individual small-scale attacks were working, so there was a movement on foot there. But I sort of speculated, the intellectuals like Paul, who was an intellectual, he was, well-educated, elite Jew, and he would likely have known that, hey, this little stabbings and killings was probably not going to really do it in the long run. And
so Paul had a tremendous imagination. There's no evidence that he was much of a scholar. There's no evidence that he could even read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. So he was not a scholar of things Jewish. His claims about having studied Rabban Gamliel are lies, because to study with Rabban Gamliel you'd have to speak Hebrew. All evidence we have is that Paul could not speak Hebrew. Like he was relying upon Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, what Christians called the Old Testament. So from everything we know, Paul didn't speak Hebrew. Paul, I think, was from Tiberias. There were no Jewish academies there. All right, so he was Jewishly ignorant, but had a superficial understanding of the Hebrew Bible gained through the Greek translation Septuagint, and he had ambition and imagination.
And we have to think sort of harder and deeper about how we can go about really undermining the basis for the Romans. We can't just kill them off one by one. That'll take centuries. So we need to try something else. We need to try to attack their basic picture of the world, the structure of their belief system, their the moral basis for the worldview.
Okay, I don't think it holds up to see the Apostle Paul as being primarily motivated by trying to take down the Romans. Right? There isn't a lot of anti-Roman sentiment in the Apostle Paul. There's some, but there's plenty of render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. There's some anti-Jewish sentiment.
you can imagine them thinking, like, maybe that will work on, at least on the masses, if not the Romans themselves, if we can at least sort of get the masses away from the Romans and towards, on our side, a little bit more towards our side of the world.
Right, so it's not unknown that a person with an above average intelligence, such as Paul, will sell something to the masses that he thinks will get the masses moving in a direction he likes. So you see the same kind of phenomenon with Donald Trump. He's the great pro whisperer. You know, he knows how to speak to the 95 IQ crowd, like almost no other politician in the last 20 years.
Then we might sort of really undermine a common support for Rome. We might sort of get kind of sympathy in some sense from the masses, and maybe that will have an effect. And I really kind of think that was sort of the real insight. I mean, it was kind of a brilliant insight that Paul, who was by consensus the first writer, the first Christian writer, his letters are the first documents in Christian history. So he must have been the first to kind of concoct this idea that he envisions this very skeletal structure of a theology. It's very bare bones. You really see nothing of the detail in the letters of Paul. All the details come later in the Gospels, and those don't appear until Paul's gone.
Right.
So he either knows nothing about them or he had nothing to do with them.
Yeah, Paul was not a systematic thinker. He was not a systematic theologian. Right. He was someone with a tremendous imagination.
What to do with them, we don't really know for sure. But Paul, we can imagine, constructed a bare bones theology about a God who came to earth. He's here for you. He sacrificed himself for you. He got crucified. He got raised from the dead. And you too can do that if you believe in us. Don't believe in those Romans. You can believe in believe in our new story about this rabbi Jesus from Nazareth. And there's great benefits. Yeah. So that was a kind of an interesting little story that you can imagine Paul constructs, and he's ready to promote that among the masses.
Yeah, I would want to stress this, because this is something that I think I would suggest that most average Christians actually don't know, which is that Paul never read the Gospels.
Yeah, right. If you understand your religion, you're not really religious. So, of course, most people don't have a profound understanding of their own religion. It just happens to be the social club that they were raised in.
Paul never met Jesus. And and these are letters to, again, various sects of Christianity where he's kind of, hammering away at ideology. And, that's...
Well, these weren't sects of Christianity. They were sects of the Jesus movement. There wasn't really a Christianity in the first century.
That's wrong. That's heretical. This is the right one. So he's a kind of movement organizer, is the best way of describing him. But there's the other thing that I would stress is that Paul found Jesus in the Old Testament. So again, there's the story of the trip to Damascus and Epiphany and so on. But he never met the historical figure Jesus. If he existed, he kind of found him in the text. And so Christianity is profoundly Jewish in that sense. There is a...
Okay, Christianity isn't profoundly Jewish because Paul was able to read Jesus into the text of the Hebrew Bible, any more than Buddhism would be profoundly 40 just because I'm able to, say, read the sacred text of Buddhism and see myself foretold there. Islam is not profoundly 40 if I can read the Quran and see myself prophesied there. Right? Your ability to read your imagination into some ancient text doesn't mean that it's really there in the text. Right? It doesn't make Christianity profoundly Jewish.
It isn't like God chose the Jews for a time and then he just created this whole new thing. It has nothing to do with the Old Testament. No, the myth of Jesus and even the story of Jesus emerged from the Old Testament. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't important differences, but of course there are. But it is profoundly Jewish in its inception.
No, that doesn't make it profoundly Jewish. All right, there are claims, all right, wanting to take on the mantle of things Jewish, but reading Jesus into the Hebrew Bible doesn't make Christianity profoundly Jewish.
Absolutely. I mean, that was the milieu, that was the context in which everything emerged. I mean, Paul is an elite, educated Jew. I mean, he's going to think in Jewish terms like Jews do today. I mean, it hasn't changed in 2,000 years.
Paul was not educated Jewishly. He couldn't even read Hebrew. There's absolutely no basis to believe that he was literate in Hebrew. All evidence shows that he couldn't read Hebrew, ergo he was a Jewishly ignorant Jew.
And he's going to draw from his background. He has expertise in the Old Testament. Certainly he did. He really knew the...
He didn't know the Hebrew Bible. He relied on a Hebrew translation. Just shows you how ignorant he was.
The Jewish Bible, that was obvious thing. So he's going to clearly draw from those morals and fables as best he can. He wants to construct a Jewish-friendly theology as much as possible because that's the objective. But I suspect, and this is where I differ with some of the mythicists, I think there probably was an actual person. I think there was an actual guy, an actual rabbi. Maybe he was called Jesus. Maybe he was from Nazareth. We don't know. Probably he was agitating on behalf of the poor and the impoverished against the Romans. He might have been sort of a political agitator, and trying to drive those invaders out and so forth. He probably had kind of a little bit of a moral backbone there. It was opposing the Romans, and if you got visible enough and you caused enough stir, then the Romans strung you up on a cross and they crucified you, and that was the punishment, the Roman punishment for political agitators. So I can imagine all that probably actually happened. Probably wasn't Jesus, agitated, got crucified, and then a few years later, Paul comes along, and maybe he's drawing from this actual story. Again, this is sort of my speculation, but of course, it's obvious. If you want to construct a hoax to deceive people, it's always best to include as much truth in it as you can.
Sure.
Because it's going to sound more verifiable. It's going to sound more true, right? If anybody checks anything, yeah, there actually was that Jesus guy. Yeah, I remember him. Yeah, he was a great guy. He was a great teacher. Okay, he really did exist. So it makes sense that Paul would have drawn from an actual person, life and probably death, and then gone back to the Old Testament and drew bits and pieces that kind of seem to mesh with that story. From what I've seen, it's typically biblical. It's very cryptic sort of stuff. When you look at people say, oh, the Old Testament anticipated Jesus coming. Well, look at there's very obscure sort of passages and say, well, that sounds a little...
Yeah, you can read anything you want into a text, including the Hebrew Bible. So that's eisegesis, when you read a meaning into the text. Exegesis is when you deduce a meaning from the text. So Christianity is engaged in eisegesis, not exegesis.
It's a little bit like this, and that could be interpreted as this. And okay, that's very useful when you want to make a story. So I can imagine that Paul did that. He took little bits and pieces, maybe not even him, maybe more even the gospel writers than Paul himself. But Paul could have taken little elements of the Old Testament and matched it to this guy's life, and then started to use that to build this. The 3 days. People talk about the 3 days in the cave. Well, that sounds like 3 days. Noah's 3 days in the whale. These kinds of things. So you can sort of construct parallels that were there in the Old Testament and sort of weave.
Yeah, and you can do all that from a translation. You don't need to know the Hebrew to come up with these imaginative roaming.
Weave those into the life of someone who existed and make kind of an interesting and compelling new story.
Right, and in Daniel, there is the image of a suffering Christ, a suffering Messiah, which I think would go against other versions of the Messiah who would be more David-like, that there would be a warrior king who would come out of nowhere and start kicking ass.
Okay, the notion of some suffering Messiah who takes the world's sins upon his shoulders is unknown in Judaism.
Obviously, that Jesus doesn't do that at all. But again, there is very strong precedent.
And the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 refers to the Jewish people. Right? It refers to Israel, it doesn't refer to an individual.
I've been exposed also to Daniel in the sense of many, particularly Protestant Christians, will say, this is the text that the Jews don't want to know about, because this just...
Let me just fast forward through this nonsense.
And of course, that was a very hard sell at the time, because the Jews were just crushed. The Romans rolled in and boom, they're just...
Yeah, it was a hard sell then. It was a hard sell 100 years later. It was a hard sell 200 years later. Like, Jews who know anything about Judaism and the Hebrew Bible just simply don't buy the claims of Christianity. They don't buy the claims made for Jesus, right? Only Jewishly ignorant Jews can buy into this, because it's completely repellent from a Jewish perspective. The idea of this cannibalistic ritual sacrifice where you eat the flesh and drink the blood of the God who's been sent to earth to die on a cross, right? This is all repellent from a Jewish perspective.
Just trampled underfoot. So you were hard pressed to look for a warrior king who was going to save you at that point. It was a lot easier to find the suffering victim.
Jews have never looked for a Messiah who's a suffering victim. Right? First of all, the doctrine of the Messiah plays very little importance in the way that Jews lead their lives. Right? It's an esoteric piece of storytelling that doesn't have much practical significance. And then, to the extent it does have a significance, it's ever some individual suffering for the world's sins.
The suffering victim who took a moral position, got himself killed, and now he's beloved of God because he was such a great guy. That's a whole lot easier story to sell at the time that Paul is constructing his theme.
Yeah, it was an easier story to sell to Gentiles, not an easy story to sell to Jews. Jews are a tough audience. You ever spoken to a group of Jews, you know that they're kind of feisty, and have one very nice Protestant friend who had a lot of Jews at her event. Like right in the middle of her talk, someone stood up and said, some Jews stood up and said, I've never heard such nonsense, my whole life. Jews are a tough audience. They don't just sit back and passively buy into things.
Theology. So yeah, it makes sense. Paul must have known both sides. He would have known about the warrior king side and sort of the suffering savior. And he's like, all right, I'll take Savior, because I can match that to the guy who got crucified a couple years ago, and I can make a good story out of that.
Right. So do you
Yeah, that wouldn't sell to Jews. That would sell to more credulous non-Jews.
do you think that Paul's motivations were ideological in this sense, and in some ways cryptic in the sense that he was trying to create this ideology that would undermine the Roman ideology and many ideologies of
Paul had a tremendous imagination, right? He had a gift with words. He had a high verbal IQ. Don't think you need to go deeper than that. Outside the Sydney Opera House, listening to Richard Spencer talk to philosopher David Skarbina.
Anti-Roman side, and maybe get to divide a little bit of the kind of the basic Jewish goodness. Maybe that'll serve 2 or 3 purposes. I can guess that kind of thing was maybe going on in Paul's mind. You don't know how much he was really planning. A lot of this kind of, I don't know, maybe it's sort of spun out of control. It was kind of ran away from him. It's hard to tell with Paul because it's such a sketchy theology, and all the details that we know don't come until later. So Paul either didn't know or maybe had nothing to do with all the later details about what the meek Jesus did and said. I mean, there's none of that in Paul.
Right.
It's just the Savior's here. He died. He went to heaven, and you can go to heaven too. Very bare bones. But even that was enough to A, get you opposed to the Roman pantheon, Roman theology,
Yeah.
and B, according to Nietzsche, I mean that alone was a highly destructive move, because now suddenly your real world, your saved world, is in the beyond. It's
Right.
after you die. This world is kind of the pain and suffering, and you're carrying your cross with Jesus, and you're suffering like him, and maybe you're dying on the cross or whatever. So this world is a nasty, ugly, suffering place, and the next world is a good place, and that's what you're looking forward to. And both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche kind of said, well, look, this is a highly destructive view of life. I mean, you're supposed to be a creature of
Okay, so it's not just a highly destructive view of life. It has some upsides and downsides like everything else. So telling people that the next world will be much, much better, right, that's going to act as an opiate. That's going to reduce pain in this life. But it comes at a price, and it makes this life less important. So people are likely to be less passionate about this life if they believe the next life is more important than this life. But it's also a very easy drug to sell.
of the world. You're in the world. You're part of the world. A normal human being wants to live a good life, to be happy, to be satisfied with how things are, and not view every day as kind of a tribulation and a trial and suffering and pain and nastiness. And maybe I hope someday I'll be better when I'm gone. So both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche said this is a highly life-denying, life-negative view of the world, because the true life is the afterlife. It's not this world. It's not here now. It's the next one, and that has all kinds of repercussions about how you live your life and attitudes towards things, and other people, and towards your own health, and towards sickness. I mean, really very far-reaching consequences that I suspect neither Paul nor the gospel writers really knew about it. I mean, they just wanted a really good hook. They wanted to really hook people in. Well, what's a better hook than you get to live forever, man? You don't have to die. You get to live forever in a happy place. And to me, that was just a big hook to get the people in. But it has a lot of really negative consequences for society.
I can't imagine if people were at the Sydney Opera House on Sydney Harbour, looking out at the beautiful Sydney Harbour Bridge, seeing all these happy, healthy people. Can't imagine that they'd primarily be looking forward to the next life rather than this life. I think the more miserable you are, the more you're going to look forward to the next life. The happier you are, the more you want to make something of this life.
Society over the years. And I think that was, to their credit, that's what both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche really latched onto, and to really stress that point.
Right. Well, what are some of those consequences? Because I think there are a lot of contradictions and tensions within Christianity. First off, what you were saying, and also what Nietzsche said about Christianity, I mean, this is obviously true. You're rejecting the world. It's a veil of tears, etc.
That's only an aspect of Christianity, right? That's the Hellenic mystery cult aspect of Christianity, to reject this world. There are also this worldly affirmations of Christianity. The afterlife is for losers and poofters. God forbid, God forbid.
I think a veil of tears, that line of words comes from the Psalms, comes from the Old Testament, so all of these things have precedence. But, at the same time, Christianity does exist as a kind of fertility cult. I mean, it is directly...
And the chat says, I'm 24 years old, I have no friends, no future, no job skills. It's time that I confront reality. Yes. And you're already doing that, mate. I got great news for you. You're already confronting reality by what you just spelled out. If that's accurate, then you are well on the way towards embracing reality and therefore making progress to succeed in this world.
Being Christian, whatever the cause might be, being Christian is directly correlated with having babies.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because I think actually that's not true. Or that was actually, I think it was a...
So Christianity acts right now as a natalist movement, but you'll find plenty of things in the tradition, all right, that is anti-natalist, against having kids. So it varies.
very, well, relatively recent innovation.
It's complicated.
And there's some really interesting stuff, particularly in Schopenhauer. If you read the second volume of his book, Parallel, which is really kind of not a well-known book, but Schopenhauer really does a really striking job. He argues that Paul was really anti-family, anti-natalist.
And Media Hit says there's no tide to fight against in Sydney. And Australia's had fairly rigorous immigration policies, and so we don't have high rates of crime. Right? It's the best place in the world to be an average bloke. So life is pretty good.
This is where the mission comes in, right? So there's lots of passages in the Bible. Well, you're supposed to be chaste and give your devotion to God and don't love other women or whatever.
Yeah, but life isn't just theory, right? You got a theory that brings people together, all right? Then it's already on its path to being natalist, right? You bring men and women together, they're going to copulate and have kids, and they're going to form bonds and build families. So it's about 68 degrees and sunny. It's Friday afternoon. It is 3:15 p.m. in Australia.
That advice a little too seriously, apparently.
Right, but it's interesting. Both in Paul,
Castrated himself and repeated it.
Both in Paul and in the gospel writers, they hit this idea that you're supposed to love God and Jesus. You're not supposed to have a mortal life of love. You're supposed to give yourself completely to this movement, and any sort of human attachments take away from that. So there's a story where Jesus says you have to, leave your mother and father and your wife and your children and come follow me. And, and there's a couple of really interesting passages. I think they're really very not well known, where Paul's like, don't have sex. You can be married, but even when you're married.
So here the philosopher is concentrating on the words and the theory, all right? But words and theory are not necessarily the things that are most determinative, all right? Philosophers love words, academics love words. There's no November here, but there is still no nut November. Even though it's gorgeous, there's still a no nut November, guys. Speaking as the no-fap maximalist.
You're married, don't have sex. I mean, it's really sort of blunt. You say, well, what's going on here? And you're thinking like, well, I don't know, it's kind of a pathological, like, don't be happy, don't enjoy the happiness that goes along with this, first of all. And secondly, it's really an anti-natalist, anti-birth strategy, right? I mean,
yeah, but that's just the words, right? And the words don't mean nothing, but they're not necessarily determinative. There are things more important than words, such as the effects of words.
It's an interesting thing. If I was wanting to screw up your society, I might try to say, God doesn't really want you to have children. He wants you to devote yourself to Him. Be monk-like or be nun-like. What are those people? Why are they chaste, right? Because that's part of the story.
Well, somehow Christianity survived for 2,000 years because it has been substantially natalist, despite these anti-natalist parts in its theory and scriptures.
Being completely devoted to God and don't have sex and don't have kids. And that, I think there was a very strong argument, and Schopenhauer really does a brilliant job of explaining that was really there in all throughout the New Testament, really all aspects of the New Testament. It was only later, a couple hundred years later, when the non-Jewish Christians figured out, like, hey man, this is a losing strategy. We want a big religion. We want big families and lots of followers. So we got to drop that anti-natalist thing and start saying, hey, we need to have lots of kids. So they just sort of push that all.
Yeah, nonverbal cues hold more power than barbs thrown in chat rooms. So words only account for about 10% of communication. Right? What's much more important is the emotional state, the body language, all right, the context, all right. Words are only a minor part of communication.
That all stuff to the side. They ignored what Paul said in the gospel letters, and they somehow out of the blue kind of told them all be fruitful and multiply, they took Old Testament stuff, and they applied it to the New Testament, even though Jesus didn't say that, and then they turned it into a very, family-friendly, big family, have lots of kids, very Catholic kind of view. Yeah. It's not there in the original view, and that accords with the Jesus hoax theory, which says it was kind of a Jewish kind of thing that was meant to undermine the pagan masses, and that's a good way to do it. Get them to not have good relationships, get them to not have sex, get them to not reproduce. Well, what the heck, I know that.
Okay, Christianity was not some Jewish conspiracy to undermine the pagan masses and get them not to have kids, right? This idea of not having kids and that sex is bad, you shouldn't even have sex with your spouse, right? That's very not Jewish, right? You'll find 1,000 texts against it in Judaism.
I mean, that's a benefit to the Jewish power structure.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at this.
No, it's not a benefit to the Jewish power structure, right? Christianity, despite those aspects of its theory, has been natalist from the beginning, otherwise it would not have survived. Those sects of Christianity that are anti-natalist have died out, just as you would expect.
as happening today as well, because I do think that Christianity, the impulse of Christianity, is an impulse that you can see in a variety of different movements. And I am fully on board with you in terms of conservation of the natural world. That being said, you can also see some really toxic little drops of poison placed in that movement. Granted that these are just anecdotal, but you can find people who will do these confessional videos on TikTok or YouTube where they're saying, global warming is here, and this is why I have decided to never have children, and you're welcome, world. I'm reducing population. Okay, I get that on some level, to be fair, but this highly intelligent, thoughtful, open-minded person is kind of exactly the type of person that we would want to reproduce. The people living in abject poverty in a favela are not going to heed the warnings of global warming. They're just going to go.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, the very people who are so concerned about global warming, all right, those socially aware people are the types you want to reproduce. All right, so we're in a dysgenic spiral because people who are the most socially aware and the most intelligent and the most educated, all right, they're the ones who are least likely to reproduce. And those who are the least thinking, those who are the least contemplative, all right, they're the ones most likely to reproduce. So how do we encourage the better sorts to reproduce and discourage, right, those who we don't want to reproduce their bad character traits? This is the magnificent Sydney Opera House. Make you cavell. They're beautiful. Friday afternoon in the city. Paul Logan used to work on that bridge, mate. Okay, look at these beautiful seats. Look at that lovely golden hue. Okay. Let's get back to conversation with philosopher David Skrbina.
Go and have a bunch of sex, understandably. But so there is a kind of radical dysgenic poison that you can see that comes in these it comes in these left wing. I mean, I'm using the word left loosely here, but it comes.
Do I walk on the streets at night where there are bars and clubs? Only a little bit. I've only done that accidentally. So I've kind of reverted to my 56-year-old self. I'm sure there are obnoxious tourists. I haven't encountered any. I haven't encountered any obnoxiousness. Am I heading to King's Cross later? No, I'm not heading to King's Cross later, mate. I'm heading to shore later, like a holy Jew.
Comes in these movements, and you can just see someone almost in real time who might have had very good instincts kind of naturally get poisoned. I could even go further in terms of the transgender issue and so on. I mean, these are, whatever else you want to say about them, they are radically anti-natalist visions of the world. And
yes, they are, right? And I think it comes from Hellenic mystery cult religion. Yeah, there's probably some organized crime in Sydney, but not very much, and it's much better to have organized crime than disorganized crime. What you don't want is unorganized crime. So organized crime only kills people who are in the game. So there used to be a Jewish mob boss, Abe Saffron, I think was perhaps headquartered in King's Cross.
They actually have an effect on the population, even in a fairly small way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, obviously there's different issues coming together here, but I mean, there's no doubt that the planet is massively overpopulated by humans. In fact, today, maybe you know today.
Yes, there is a doubt. All right, it's not at all clear that the planet is massively overpopulated by humans. Right, I think we can handle 8 billion.
It's the 8 billion human day. You probably saw that, right? The UN today, November 15th, they officially declared that today we now have 8.
So this philosopher David Skrbina, he wrote for, he ran for office for the Green Party. Man, I wish they'd turn down that music blaring in the background. Abe Saffron sounds like a character in an Evelyn Waugh novel. So just one F, I believe, in Saffron. I think he may have been Jewish.
8 billion people. Historically, for most of the 2 million years of human existence, that number was about 50 million. Sometimes as low as 1 million. At one point down to a few tens of thousands.
Yeah, organized criminals tend to have gang truces. They respect each other's territories, less random shootings. Yeah, clean city. Look at this. No trash, no graffiti.
But certainly for 99% of human existence, I mean, it was like, a quarter of a few million.
Yeah.
And that's how the planet evolved. The other life forms evolved, and we all kind of were in balance, and the typical kind of evolutionary story. And then we hit the Industrial Revolution, and zoom, we monopolized ourselves. And of course, that throws everything out of balance. And now the planet is, in fact, massively overpopulated.
Jim Bell.
But you're right. You tend to have the people who volunteer to be fewer people are the ones that you wanted more of, and vice versa. The we're just the consumers and just the reproducers. I don't know. I mean, sort of independent Christians.
Right.
You kind of want to bring that bit back. You kind of want to bring back the Christian message and say, hey, masses, you don't actually really need to have 12 kids. Maybe one or two would be okay, and you're going to live forever.
So this guy, David Scorbina, the stream went down for 15 seconds, but this guy speaking, a philosopher, David Scorbina, he ran for office for the Green Party. He's also an active member of BDS, Boycott, Divest, Sanction Israel, and he works at a university in Michigan, and he says that 90% of the Arab students support BDS.
So we kind of need a new version of that in this present-day overpopulated world. We need a new kind of theology or something.
Yeah, well, I think they want to have sex more than they want to have large families. If you poll people, they will say, "Oh, I want to have one child or two children." But understandably, I'm not casting judgment. I mean, particularly me, I'm not casting judgment. They want to have sex, so it just seems like there could be some kind of reasonable solution to that allows them to enjoy life. Sex is a part of life, and to enjoy life, but not to create situations that they can't certainly sustain and the world can't sustain. Okay, well, let's go back to Christianity. So, was it Paul who developed the innovation of bringing the Jewish message to the Gentiles? Was that kind of his major innovation?
Yes.
In fact, he says that explicitly. Right? He's the apostle to the Gentiles.
Right.
He took that on himself. For whatever reason, he felt the most competent or the most capable of, I know those Gentiles. I can speak their language. I know what motivates them. I will.
Yeah. Jim says that Abe Saffron, going back to the 1950s, 60s, maybe the 70s, was the most powerful organized crime gangster in Australia.
We'll pitch this message to them. So he took that on, and that was kind of what he...
So the Apostle Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. Right, prior to Paul, the Jesus movement was entirely aimed at the Jews. Then Paul came along.
They had other people who were working on the Jews. So they kind of had a double problem in this internal Jewish community that they kind of contained.
So Abe Saffron ran King's Cross, which is like was the vice capital of Sydney. And Australia used to have very strict censorship, anti-pornography laws, but there are a lot of Jewish lawyers and publishers who managed to open up Australia's free speech laws and legalize pornography. And that really got going in 1969 with Portnoy's complaint. So Portnoy's complaint was initially banned in Australia, and then some Jewish lawyers got involved, and they managed to legalize literature like Portnoy's complaint, and that led to the legalization of pornography in general.
Oh, yeah.
So Jews led the way, opening up sexual expression in King's Cross, and Abe Saffron was the king of vice in King's Cross. King's Cross was the vice capital of Australia.
Hey, this is a good thing for us. You don't have to really believe it. It's not your military savior king that you wanted, but just kind of let us go. Let us run with it because it's going to be good for us on the one hand, and then on the outside, Paul's going saying, live forever and believe in me and follow this Jewish God Jehovah. And, this is a great thing. So, Paul seems to have been the first to really pick up that stick and run to the.
Yeah, it's a very popular message. Tell people they can live forever. Like if that's your primary concern, your individual salvation, live forever. Christianity does that better than anyone.
Gentile masses really push this story.
Why do you think it failed among the Jews? And at least eventually. I mean, obviously the first Christians were Jews, but why did it fail? Or is there another story? Did it just fail?
Why did it fail with the Jews? Because it's so much the antithesis of the Jewish tradition. God cannot become man. You don't get individual eternal salvation just by believing some things. Like individual salvation is not the focus in Judaism, it's more community oriented. And it's more this worldly oriented than next worldly. So what Paul was selling was a heavily pagan Hellenic mystery cult religion with a Jewish gloss.
Fail among a part of them.
Oh, right. I mean, it was never intended for the Jews.
Yeah, it didn't fail. We're just a part of Jews. Jews, more than any other people, were the most resistant to the claims of Christianity, because Jews were the most likely to know the Jewish text, the Hebrew Bible, and recognize that Christianity was not a complement to this text.
I think Paul never. I think he was just flat out liar.
Right.
Does he-
Jesus, that was intended, don't you think? Or Jesus, if we imagine a kind of minimal Jesus,
But that is part of the
might have probably existed.
yeah.
Was he?
That's like
What are your thoughts on that? I
think the Orthodox Jews were stuck to their warrior king kind of savior. They were having none of this kind of Jesus who gets himself killed. Well, that's a pathetic figure. We're not buying it.
Yeah, the Jews were like Donald Trump. Their war heroes didn't get captured, right? Like, what kind of people glorify war heroes who are only heroic for getting captured? Right? That's not the Jewish perspective. Jewish heroes make a difference in this world, right? If you don't make a difference in this world, you're not a Jewish hero.
And they have no reason to. Paul doesn't really want them to change. I think he's really a Judaic Jew at heart. I think he doesn't really want to give up. He doesn't want people to give up. He's just like saying, well, let's just go along with the story. Just understand why we're doing this. We're going to pitch this to the superstitious masses because we can get a lot of benefit out of it. And, you can imagine maybe there was internal struggles. Like, was this a good idea? No, it's not good. You're sort of, maybe it's blasphemous to pick a rabbi and say he's really, he's the savior, but he wasn't. You can imagine various, fanatical Jewish groups kind of, go.
Yeah, when you don't follow anything. All right, when you don't succeed with anything, right, that was predicted that the Messiah would accomplish, all right, you're 0 for 50, all right, then Jews aren't going to buy in. So no, it's not a matter of, I think Christianity is bunk. I'm sure Christianity is a valid road to God for many people. It's one hero system among thousands of hero systems, and having a hero system is an absolute biological necessity. You can't live without a hero system. So Christianity works for many people. Man, I'm trying to do a live stream here. Why did they have to blare music in the background?
Going back and forth, and you kind of see that if any of that part of the New Testament is true, there was a lot of internal squabbles going on, even in the Gospels. I mean, this is like the Gospel of John, right? Famously, where he talks about he's very anti-Jewish passages, right? Jews are that your father is the devil, and so forth, right?
Yeah.
And so people are acting like, wow, those guys are anti-Semites. Like, no.
Yeah, so the anti-Jewish passages in the New Testament take place within the context of intra-Jewish disputes. Yeah, without Christianity, there'd be no 12 steps. 12-step movement comes very much out of American Protestant Christianity. So when I found myself back in churches, in Protestant churches, going to 12-step meetings over the past 11 years, I think, how the hell did my life turn out this way? Never thought I'd have to enter a church again. Thought I completely left that behind, but my life goes full circle. Keep ending up at Protestant churches, going to 12-step meetings.
That was one group of Jews opposing another group of Jews. That was an inter-Jewish squabble, probably over the theology, because the main group, they want their warrior king, and then the Christian Jews want their little suffering Jesus figure. And you can imagine really getting heated the way Jews like to do. They get really emotional about these conflicts, and then the one Jew say, well, you're with the devil, you're with Satan because you're not going along with this. And I think that shows up in the text, right? And that's
so Jews have low murder rates, right? Jews don't tend to commit a lot of violent crime, but they do tend to be verbally violent.
To me, that's and there's others too who support the same view. It's an inter-Jewish squabble that shows up in the text, and you see this anti-Semitic kind of passages. There's only a few of them, but they're there in the Gospels to probably reflect this internal squabbling over theology.
Yeah, right. The Gospels seem to get more anti-Semitic as they go along. It's almost
they got exactly the later one. So John would have been the last of the 4 Gospels to be written. Right. That seems.
So Mark was the first Gospel written around year 70. Then Matthew was written about 5-10 years later. Mark was written after Matthew, and then John was written around year 110 of the Common Era.
Seems to be the most anti-Semitic. So yeah, you can imagine sort of the conflicts brewing over time, building up over time. And right. Is it not like, I've had enough of you guys, you're with the devil, and blah blah blah. You can imagine that
well, you can imagine like a Democratic Party in Michigan or something where at first they're like, all right, Marx, yeah, we're good with Marx. Come on in and vote Democrat, come on in. And then 4 years later they're like, you damn commies, get out of here. And it's just kind of a natural progression. But to imagine them as like anti-left or something is just simply wrong. These are internal squabbles, as you say. So okay, we're almost at an hour. Let me ask one more question, and then I can open it up. I'm going to ask one more question. of having more children. At the same time, atheism is certainly on the rise. Just in my lifetime, the amount of people who are openly agnostic or atheist is remarkable. But even among Christians, I think atheism is among the rise. The degree to which, if you ask a churchgoer to describe God, the degree to which it's this kind of blob in the sky.
So I've been talking with my 12-step sponsees that belief in God really necessarily does nothing, right? It's your experience with God. Like many of my sponsees and I, we believed in God when we were still participating in our ridiculous addictions. And where we started to get recovery was when we got some kind of visceral experience of God. And the way that I get that primarily is by listening to 12-step talks and attending 12-step meetings. Other people may get it through prayer and meditation, but there's all the world of difference in a practical sense between believing in God and having an experience of God, having a visceral connection with God, like getting wired up to God. Like if you got a power source and you don't plug into it, just believing in the power source doesn't do anything for you. So I found 12-step tremendously helpful in learning to plug into the power source. Yeah, God is a verb. There's a whole theology about God as a verb.
This kind of nice guy with a beard looking out over us. And the degree to which Christians aren't aware of their own religion, that they.
So even people who are religious lead, far more secular lives than 100 years ago, because we increase and non-religious explanations of around us. We work in an economy that's not regulated by religion. Right? Our world steadily becomes more neoliberal, more economically efficient, and there's less and less enchantment and magic in the world around us.
They couldn't actually even tell you the most basic story of the religion that they follow is actually pretty remarkable. There has been a kind of dumbing down, and we're kind of moving out of a middle-class society. So what are your thoughts of these things moving forward? Because at least from my view, there seems to be a lot of countervailing movements. I could very well imagine out of this secular postmodern world a really strong fundamentalism arising out of it.
So I don't see any way to reverse the steady decline in the power of religion. Right? I just don't see how that can be reversed in the Western world. I just don't see how the Western world, industrialized societies, become more religious in the years ahead. Like we now have the first secular societies, Northern Europe, right? Protestant countries secularized before Roman Catholic ones, because Protestantism has been refined to being more a matter of the heart than of practice. Catholicism retains ritual, so it retains some more elements of magic and mystery. The Northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, the first overwhelmingly secular societies in human history. And that hasn't been followed by a massive moral decline either. Like it used to be considered inconceivable, how will a society survive if it's not religious, if it's not God-fearing? Well, it seems to go on pretty much as it did before. Bye-bye. G'day mate, 40 here by the Sydney Opera House. So I'm listening to this New Yorker article on do we change over the course of our life, right? There are some people who see things more in terms of staying the same, continuity, and other people who see themselves more in terms of distinct phases. But there was one breakdown of personalities from a study at University of Dunedin in New Zealand. And they divide people into three camps. That there are those who move towards life. Right, so I think that would be roughly compatible with the secure attachment. So when people like you and you like them and they're good for you, you move towards them. When people treat you badly, you move away from them. So that's probably the dominant personality type, where you move towards life, you move towards people. And then there are those who move away from people. So if you're joining a new school in 8th grade, right, those who move towards will make friends, join clubs, get socially active. And then those who move away will read a lot of books. So I guess I'm a personality that likes to move away. And then those who move against will cause trouble. So I've got a part of me that likes to move towards life, a large part of me that likes to move away from life and live stream and read books, and then another part of me that likes to move against life. So this refers to the criminally inclined and the thrill seekers. So I've got some thrill-seeking personality traits. But I think you see these tendencies all around you. There are those who move towards other people, towards connection. There are those who move away. Then there are those who move against. And so if you have a relationship with someone who moves away, then that person's not likely to be very social. Right? You're not going to be able to take them to a lot of social events. They're going to need a lot of time on their own. So we're probably talking about an avoidant personality. Then someone who moves against the world, right? Talking about someone who's low in agreeableness. It's going to create a lot of turbulence. It's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, right? So easiest relationships, I would think, would be two people who move towards life, towards each other, towards other people, towards connection. And if you get a marriage between someone who moves towards and someone who moves away, I think there'd be a lot of emptiness and lack of connection. And if someone who moves towards life marries someone who moves against life, against the world, right? Again, a lot of conflict. I have a hard time imagining that would go too well. There are socially effective personalities and less socially effective personalities. So socially effective personalities, above average in agreeableness, above average in conscientiousness, more extroverted than introverted, open to new experience, and low in neuroticism. And Jews, generally speaking, have these types of personalities. Right? These are the personalities that tend to make for success in life. To be more extroverted than introverted, to be less neurotic, to have openness to new experience, to be more conscientious than average, and to be more agreeable than disagreeable. Right? People who are more agreeable, they're obviously going to get along better with other people. They're going to have a better reputation in the community. People are more likely to like them. So there are studies that show that Jews have more socially effective personalities. Now, we can shape our personality to some degree. We all tend to become more conscientious as we age. We tend to become more agreeable as we age. We tend to become less neurotic as we age. And we can do concrete things to become more conscientious, more agreeable, more extroverted, more open to new experience, and less neurotic. And we're looking out at the beautiful Sydney Harbour. There's the Sydney Harbour Bridge. There are tours where you can walk to the top. I think I see a bunch of people atop the Sydney Harbour Bridge right now.